This episode contains mature content.
Did you know that Jesus Calling has its own YouTube channel? It's full of great content that will enhance your spiritual life. You'll find beautiful videos with short devotional moments to help you through your day, as well as stories on video from celebrities, authors, pastors, and everyday people who share what their faith journey has meant to them. You'll also find the Jesus Listens Stories of Prayer series hosted by Susie McIntyre Eaton, featuring new guests monthly. Subscribe today for new videos each week.
I think as long as our eyes are constantly fixed on Him, that makes all the difference, because it takes your eyes off the mountain and puts them on the one who can move those mountains.
Welcome to the Jesus Calling podcast. This week, we get to hear from Becky Murray, the founder and CEO of One by One, an organization committed to ending exploitation and bringing freedom to vulnerable children around the world. Becky's journey began with a simple desire to fight injustice, a passion that eventually led her from her dreams of a law career to the front lines of global humanitarian work. Becky shares how a pair of pink flip-flops sparked a lifelong mission, and why she believes that even small acts of kindness can change the world, one life at a time. Later in the episode, we'll hear from Andrea Kazindra, co-founder and co-CEO of Musana, a Ugandan-led organization transforming communities through schools, hospitals, and businesses. What began as a college internship turned into a lifelong commitment to creating sustainable, locally driven change. Nearly 2 decades later, Andrea continues to lead with humility, vision, and a deep belief in the power of community. Let's begin with Becky's story.
Hey, I'm Becky Murray, and I'm the founder and CEO of an organisation called One by One, where we are super passionate about ending exploitation and seeing children come into complete freedom. I come from the north of England, which is why I don't talk quite as posh as the Queen once did. So the north of England, we're known for our northern tones. My mum and dad just loved Jesus, and so I was brought up pretty much living in the church. As a young girl, I was always super passionate about tackling injustice. Injustice for me was like the red rag to a bull. My mum and dad would even tease me that I would count how many chips were on my plate, because as the youngest of 3 siblings, my older sisters always got the larger portions, which I was furious about because my loves in life are Jesus and food. And becoming a teenager, I thought I would become a lawyer and tackle injustice that way. But it was while I was out on a missions trip to Romania, I felt God speak to me for the first time about helping to establish some sort of a safe place for vulnerable children. And that completely changed the whole trajectory of my life, really. And so as it stands today, I am now fighting injustice, but in a very different way from what I thought it would be when I was a young girl. I went on this journey where I'd got this promise from God, where God had spoke to me in Romania. But then what do you do with this promise? I went on this 13-year kind of waiting for God's promises to unfold in my life. So during that time, I would go on short-term missions trips to learn from other people. And one such trip was going to Sierra Leone with my local church in 2006. And I was working alongside an evangelist, and then I would do these large feeding programs at the same time. And on this particular day, I met a little girl who was 9 years old, and she was an orphan living on the streets, and she would just beg to make it from day to day. And one of the things that moved me was she simply had no shoes. Now, I work in a lot of remote parts of Africa now, and I now see that that's quite commonplace across different parts of Africa. But this was one of my first trips there, and I was just so moved to see a little girl not even own a pair of shoes. And so with me that particular day, I had the grand total of 50 pence, which is not even $1. I was a student at the time, and so I was broke. I'd used all my money to get on the mission trip in the first place. And so with my very feeble offering of 50 pence, I bartered with the market stall owner and managed to buy little 9-year-old Felicity a pink pair of flip-flops to match the pink top she was wearing. And I'll never forget, I looked up the hill and I saw Felicity running down towards us. She's got a huge smile on her face because for the first time in her life, she's now wearing shoes. And she turned to me and she said, "Should I wait in the hotel?" So I said, "No, we're literally just going on to the gospel campaign now. There's space in the vehicles. You're welcome to join us." And she said, "Yes, but shouldn't I wait in your bedroom?" I genuinely couldn't comprehend what the question was. Here's a 9-year-old girl looking at another young girl. I was in my early 20s at the time. And coming from a beautiful Christian background, I had such an overprotective dad, such a loving home environment that I couldn't process her question. And so I asked her a third time, and sure enough, she thought that I'd spent 50 pence on her so that I could then have sex with her. And that moment just utterly broke me. And in that moment, I remember looking Felicity in the eyes, but I was having a conversation with God. And the conversation was this: I'm all in. Even if it's only ever for one child, I'll give my whole life to this because no human should ever be bought or sold. The reality is, when you look at the vast needs out there, it can be overwhelming. And at the thought of there's 50 million people currently trapped in slavery today, I can't help 50 million people. And so the temptation is, because I can't fix it all, I'll shrink back and do nothing at all. And it sometimes feels like when I look out at the ocean of need before us, it feels like I've got a teaspoon in my hand and I'm attempting to empty an ocean. But the reality is, for example, God never asked the little boy to feed the 5,000. He just asked him to hand over the fish and the bread in his hands. And it's the same with our lives, where God doesn't ask us to go and feed the 5,000, but what's in our hands that we can make an impact with today. And maybe that looks like a pair of 50 pence flip-flops, but every single one of us can do something to reach the one in front of us today. I think back then, as an early 20-something-year-old, if God had talked to me about the thousands we would now be working with, I would have shrunk back. I would have said, that's too big, it's too hard, ask somebody else. But one life, I can deal with that. I can help my neighbour. And the reality is, so many times we see Jesus doing that, where he stops for one life, the woman at the well, the lady with the issue of blood, the widow in Nain. So many times he stops for one person, but in doing so, we see their whole communities or their whole towns transformed. And that's very much our heartbeat, that if we would just have eyes to see the needs of the ones that God brings across our path day in, day out, and if we just constantly have this heart of, who today can I reach? Who's my neighbour today? That if we have that mentality every day, we can see a big impact in and through our lives. That's actually why we call the organisation One by One. We've got incredible staff around the world that are running our centres. I see the change in their life. I see the kids who were supposed to not make it even past elementary education because they were so ill. And yet after encountering the love of Christ and being given the help and the medical care that they needed, they're now graduating as accountants around the world. And to see that difference that God has made in their lives is what helps keep us motivated to keep reaching that next one. In Kenya, we've been running a centre out there for over a decade now. That's a residential centre. It's primary education, secondary education. We also do medical care. We've also planted several churches in the village where we're located there. And then over in Pakistan, it looks very different. Children that were born into bonded labour and would just make bricks all day, every day in the heat of the sun. We built a safe house out there and then giving them full-time education so that once they are adults, they can go on and gain legitimate employment rather than going back into forced labour. And then over in Uganda, we're building a brand new centre. So we've been working there for a couple of years now, doing a lot of our prevention work. We've now reached over 47,000 children with that across more than 10 different countries. And it's just continuing to grow. If I'm honest, my biggest challenge is sometimes the injustice and how brutal that is. In early 2021, we'd just gone through, obviously, the impact of COVID, and it had a massive impact on many different nonprofit organizations or small businesses. And so at that moment in time, survival felt like success. And even in our own personal family, we were going through this really difficult season where life was just hard. And I remember sitting in my office in 2021 and coming up with the master plan of survival. We're not going to launch any new initiatives or take on any more staff. But then after coming up with this amazing master plan of survival, my phone rang, and it was our outreach team in Pakistan. And they said, Becky, there was a little girl in one of the factories who was 3 years old. Her name was Mercy, and 3-year-old Mercy was raped. So brutal was the attack that she didn't survive it. She died as a result. But then her little body was just left on the floor of the brick factory. And I remember in that moment thinking, God, you can see the vulnerable place that One by One as an organization is in. All of a sudden, the story of the Good Samaritan came to my mind, where Jesus very wisely selects 2 people, a priest and a Levite, a pastor and a worship leader for modern day translation. And they genuinely would have thought they were serving the call of God on their life. But when the need arose, they simply chose to look the other way. And as I'd said in my heart, not now, God, I suddenly realized I was the priest in that moment. I was the Levite. And how dare I look the other way when a 3-year-old has been raped and killed? And so it was probably one of my hardest moments in terms of saying yes to God. I remember calling our board and saying, okay, I just want you to know we're going to double our work in Pakistan. And one of them said, do we have a budget in place for that? To which the answer was, not yet. But we stepped out in faith, because when there's needs like that, how can you turn the other way? And not only did I see God bring in all the finance that we needed in order to double the size of the safe house and double our outreach programming, we are building our first ever Mercy Centre, which will be a crisis shelter, especially for little girls going through what Mercy endured in Pakistan. And the reality is, I think if we would live our lives with our hands outstretched, rather than oftentimes the temptation is to live with our hands closed off of, God, help me first, heal my family first. But actually, if we'd live with our hands open, saying, okay, God, I'm not perfect, and maybe I'm still needing healing in certain parts of my own life. But despite all that, you can still flow through me if I just say yes. And so the challenges with One by One are continuous, whether it's fighting corruption or whether it's not having the income we need for the expansion that we're doing, or whether it's being broken ourselves through seeing just the hardship of what people go through. But while ever our eyes are on Him, He navigates us through, and He provides all that we need, and all He's looking for is our yes.
To learn more about Becky Murray, visit onebyone.org, and be sure to check out her new book, Embrace the Journey, at your favorite retailer. Stay tuned to Andrea Kazindra's story after a brief message.
For over 20 years, readers have discovered the joy of spending time in the presence of the Savior with the much-loved daily devotions in Jesus Calling. Now, in the Jesus Calling Commemorative Edition, you'll feel comforted by words of hope and encouragement, and be reassured of Jesus' unending love through author Sarah Young's words of gentle guidance that are rooted in Scripture. In this deluxe edition, you'll find samples of Sarah's original handwritten devotionals, 12 new devotions she penned before her passing, letters from Sarah to readers for each month of the year, and a touching tribute from Sarah's daughter. Experience a deeper relationship with Jesus as you savor the presence of the one who understands you perfectly and loves you forever. Find the Jesus Calling Commemorative Edition today at your favorite retailer, or get 30% off your purchase at faithgateway.com.
Our next guest is Andrea Kazindra. Andrea never imagined that a summer internship would turn into a lifelong calling. As a business student, she was originally drawn to the world of microfinance, but a trip to Uganda in 2008 changed everything. What started was a visit to an orphanage, sparking the beginnings of what would become Musana, a social enterprise focused on creating sustainable, locally driven solutions in Uganda.
My name is Andrea Kazindra, and I am a co-founder and co-CEO of an organization called Musana that works in Uganda. But I'm also a mother. I have 3 biological children, 10, 6, and 1. And I have many, many children in Uganda that call me mother. So it's been a big blessing over the last, 17 years. Mostly been living in Uganda with my husband, and have had a lot of children looking up to us as parents, which has been a blessing. I had grown up in a Christian home and was always told to be the hands and feet of Jesus, and somehow ended up in business school, listening to all these lessons about profit maximization and making money. One day I was sitting in a business class and my professor brought up a picture of Muhammad Yunus, who is the founder of the concept of microfinance. And literally something just clicked in my head. I was like, this is what I want to learn about. So got online and literally searched how to go to Africa and learn microfinance. And an internship popped up. I applied and got accepted. And the summer of 2008, got on a plane to go to Uganda. When I got to Uganda, my first impression was the poverty was everywhere. We stayed with a host family, no running water, no electricity, no paved roads, chickens running around the kitchen. I had grown up in the total opposite, right? In this big house with these big roads, and everybody pulls into their garages and goes inside. And I just was so inspired by the community. The culture is so slow and communal. It was so beautiful. I was doing my microfinance internship and loving it. Every night, we would just sit on the patio and play clapping games and sing worship songs and be together. For real, who's now my husband, we formed a friendship. And one day I was asked by my program coordinator to visit an orphanage with him. But the moment of walking in was a moment I will remember for the rest of my life. Just the conditions were so shocking. 160 kids, dirty, crowded together in this compound that was also the community's trash dump. They had 2 toilets that were overflowing. I remember asking, where do the kids sleep? And they brought me to these 3 tiny rooms, dirt floors, rocky, wet from the roof would leak when it would rain. And I'm like, where are their beds? Where are their mattresses? And, no beds, no mattresses. They sleep piled together in these rooms. And just the devastation, the hopelessness, the neglect. It was by far the hardest conditions I had ever seen. I actually went home that day and I wrote in my journal, God, why did you bring me to that place? So basically, everything shifted. My whole internship was kind of thrown out the door, and I was given this massive responsibility of buying food and feeding 160 kids every day. Over the course of those few months, the kids became more than just kids that were abandoned or vulnerable, living in poverty. They became names and faces and personality. I just fell in love with them and started to uncover just layer after layer of abuse and corruption. And the directors were receiving all this money from abroad, and none of it was getting to the kids. one day we made the decision that we were going to try and close that orphanage and move the kids to a safe place. And that's when Haril and another guy, Morris, that he was living with, stepped in, and we eventually got the government to agree to give us half of the kids. On September 16th, 2008, we moved the first 40 kids to Musana, and then a couple weeks later, we moved another 40 kids. So Haril and I had just turned 21 years old and became legal guardians and legally responsible for 80 kids. None of them spoke English. So we'd play games and we'd sing songs. And one of the songs that we taught them was "You Are My Sunshine." And it became their favorite song. And I remember asking Haril and Morris, and I was like, "What is sunshine in the local language?" And they said Musana. And so it became Musana Children's Home is how we started. A lot of people were benefiting by keeping the kids in those conditions. I started to get a lot of death threats. I literally had to leave my host family. They proceeded to tell me that I was too big of a risk to stay with them anymore. I had never been more scared in my life. Every time I felt like this is too big, this is impossible, then I would remember, no, I can do this. God can do this. The orphanage that we took the kids from, I like to say that it was a tourist attraction. People would leave and send money, and it would never reach the kids. They say 80% of kids in orphanages worldwide are not orphans, right? So orphanages actually create orphans. And it's because it's what the donors want to support. So we started to track them down. Every single one of the 80 homes where these kids came from. And so we began to completely shift our model. We eventually closed the orphanage. We were constantly needing healthcare for the kids, and we could not find good quality healthcare in the community. I gave birth to our 10-year-old daughter in Uganda and delivered in one of the best hospitals in Kampala, and still had an incredibly difficult delivery. And my daughter almost died. I almost died. And so we built the hospital, and it opened in 2015. And today we have 3 hospitals. We've delivered thousands of babies safely. A woman who delivers a baby in one of Musana's hospitals is 4 times more likely that the baby will survive than if the baby is born at another facility in Uganda. One thing that I've learned being in Uganda is that prayer can be a part of every day throughout the day. The faith that Ugandans have, and I think mostly because they're so dependent on God, and I think when you don't have much and you don't know what you're gonna feed your family next week, your reliance and trust has to be in God. And so I've learned, just by watching the faith of the Ugandan people and their prayer life. Jesus Calling was probably one of the first devotionals I ever got in Uganda. My mom brought it for me on one of her first trips. And so I don't have many books on my bookshelf in Uganda, but I have Jesus Calling, and it just keeps me grounded, keeps me remembering, what the purpose is. Today, my devotional was Matthew 9, come to him with all my burdens and weariness, right? They've definitely helped me get through some of the hardest times in my life. The only reason Musana is what it is today and has grown into what it is today is because it's had God's hand in it.
To learn more about Andrea Kazindra and Musana, visit musana.org. If you'd like to hear more stories about what God can do with a willing heart, check out Lori Allen's Peace for Everyday Life video interview over on the Jesus Calling YouTube channel. Next time on the Jesus Calling podcast, we'll hear from Dawn Sheree Wilkerson, a pastor, speaker, and author. Dawn Sheree opens up about her experience with infertility and what to do when you ask God for something and receive the answer, not yet.
I've discovered the work and the wonder and the wait. I've discovered that my little surrendered to a faithful God is so much more than I could ever dream. I mean, I think about the little boy who just gave his fish and his loaves, and it fed thousands. God, I don't have enough, but put in your hands, you'll do more than I could ever dream.
Thanks for listening to the Jesus Calling Stories of Faith podcast on the Life Audio Network. Every week we'll bring you stories from people who share their journeys of faith and how prayer and a relationship with God transformed their lives. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And leave us a review so others can be inspired weekly by these stories of faith. Finally, you can find encouragement, resources, and more on the Jesus Calling website at jesuscalling.com.